Well, good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. I hope that absolutely beautiful music by George Frederick Handel has put you in the mood to travel with me this evening back to the 18th century. Handel composed Dixit Dominus in 1707, the same year that Thomas Tompion produced this magnificent table clock that you see on the right. This evening, I will be speaking with you on the engraving patterns that decorate the backplates of English table clocks. My goal is to give you an introduction to the study of backplate engraving and its potential value to collectors and dealers and museum curators. So let's begin with this Tompion clock. As lavish as the clock is on the front, it is no less well decorated on the back. The backplate is a Baroque extravaganza of swirling vines and angels and floral swags. While harmonious and symmetric and orderly, it's absolutely full of embellishments. And in these characteristics, it is the visual equivalent of Handel's music that we just heard. And just like Dixit Dominus, the central message with that eagle and the snake is about the triumph of good over evil. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, absolutely anything of value was decorated. Homespun clothes would be quite plain, but a valuable tunic would be richly embroidered. A gun used for everyday hunting would be plain, but a ceremonial gun would be engraved. Clocks were prized objects and valuable, and so it's not surprising that they would be decorated with engraving as well. Indeed, throughout the course of the 18th century, because all manner of objects were decorated, we can align changes in the patterns of engraving on clock backplates with changing tastes of English furniture and decorative arts over the course of the century. This allows us to create a sort of timeline shown here that helps to order the clocks in time and date them. So let's go to the far left and start right at the beginning. Here are three early clocks by famous makers: Edward East, Joseph Knibb, and John Fromentil. If we turn them around and look at the back, we see that the backplates have almost no decoration at all, and simply they show the maker's name. Edward East on the left had his name signed in a concave curve to perhaps reflect the movement of the pendulum. Knibb did the opposite, a convex curve, pardon me, and the Fromentils, like Dutch makers, had his name signed horizontally. But before long, clocks from the 1680s became richly engraved with floral designs, nearly always featuring tulips. England, like the Netherlands, was caught up in the tulip craze of the era, and the flower held a position of decorative authority for quite a few years. So the question arises, how did engravers go from a simple signature to executing these complex floral patterns on the back of the clocks? Well, the technology of hand engraving is deceptively simple and consists of a hand tool shown above called a burin, which has a three-sided steel blade and a wooden handle. This image from Diderot's encyclopedia actually shows copperplate engraving. We can tell it's copperplate and not brass because of the shallow angle of the engraver's tool relative to the plate. Copper is really soft compared with that steel blade, and so not much force is required to make a cut. However, a hammered brass backplate with pillars riveted to it was much more of a challenge for the engraver. This image shows the artist engraver gazing at his subject. His tools are seen on the table. He has two papers in his hand. The top paper is a drawing that he's made of the flower. And underneath of that is a tracing paper used to transfer the image to the plate. Now, the transfer process is explained in 17th century texts, but it's also beautifully demonstrated by Andrew Raftery of the Rhode Island School of Design. He demonstrates it using copperplate, but the process is the same. The transfer process involves 5 steps listed at the bottom. The artist needed to first copy the original onto the tracing paper. He then would wax the plate, then trace the image into the wax, then scratch an outline of the overall image in the plate following the wax cuts, then remove the wax, and only then was he ready to do the engraving. Let's let Mr. Raftery explain.
So I'm getting ready to trace the copy drawing. And I want to trace it, and then I'm going to flip the tracing over so I can reverse it on the plate.
The drawing that Andrew chose is by Francesco Primaticcio, and he made it in the 1540s when he was working in France. It's the kind of drawing that would have been used by an engraver, and Andrew made a copy after this drawing, and in doing so, he worked out some of the iconographic elements and the format, making it into an oval.
So I'm just going to finish it up, and then I'm ready to remove the tracing from the drawing. So I'm going to melt a little bit of wax onto this plate, and then spread it out with a roller. The wax is going to take an impression from the drawing, so I'm going to use the tracing and then trace through the tracing paper with the stylus, and that's going to leave the drawing on the plate just lightly touched onto the wax. We can see the impression of the outlines into the wax, and I'll be able to follow those outlines with the dry point tool and scratch those lines in to have a guideline for the whole process. So what I'm doing right now is I'm using this steel tool to scratch the lines in the plate. I'm following the lines I made with the wax that are impressed in the wax, and I'm scratching them in the plate with the tool. And what this is going to do is going to give me a very, very pale outline that I can follow throughout the engraving process. So I'm ready to start engraving, and I'm going to place the plate onto this sand-filled pad, and that allows me to have a kind of pivoting action when I work the plate, because one of the principles of engraving, especially for curves, is that the plate is pushed and the tool is stationary. And this is the engraving tool. It's called a burin, and it's this square steel shaft that's been inserted in this handle and polished and sharpened so that these 3 planes come to a perfect point. So I engage the tool in one of my dry pointed lines, and as I'm pushing the plate, a curl of copper is emerging, and that curl of copper is called the burr. When I get to the end of the line, I pull out the burin, and I take this tool called the scraper, and I use the scraper to cut off the burr. So once all the outlines have been laid in, I start to develop the forms with a certain kind of cross-hatching. And that's one of the most important interpretive acts of the engraver, is deciding on the various patterns that are going to be used in the cross-hatching.
Wow, it's pretty impressive when you see it in action. So here's a nice example of that shading effect, the cross-hatching he was talking about just a moment ago. It's shown on 2 backplates, Jacob Pesenius on the left, and then a more detailed and higher quality engraving by Benjamin Willoughby in a clock for Benjamin Willoughby on the right. Note the leaf border on the far right with its individually cut vertical shading lines. A finished backplate of this quality can easily involve 10,000 burn cuts. Engraving also reveals depth of field. This is a 18th century teaching work by the Dutch artist Jan Fokkema. It has multiple sites where one vine passes above another vine, creating a three-dimensional depth of field for the work. The engraver had to plan his work carefully so that the lines did not cross each other and spoil the three-dimensional effect. Returning to the backplate by Joseph Nib with the tulips, you can see this depth of field in the upper corners where the vines interlock, they rather cross each other. And of course, you can easily see it at the bottom where the highlight flower, the striped tulip, is definitely in the foreground. This gives you a feeling for how it looked as the engraver worked. He needed to first engrave the foreground images, in this case, the flower heads, and once these were in place, the deeper layers could be added. Compare, for example, panels C and D, and it shows the addition of the second underlying layer, kind of most easily seen at the base of the plate where the vines pass behind the tulips. And in the upper corners, comparing panel D with panel E, you can see that a third deeper layer has been added to complete the image. Tulip engraving is the standard basis for English clocks in the 1680s and 90s. And so it's worth pausing a moment to examine in a bit more detail some of the patterns that were used. Here's that same tulip engraved backplate done for Joseph Nib. You'll notice that it contains really three vines. One starts at the bottom and grows upwards towards the center, arriving where the name is. Meanwhile, in the top section of the plate, a vine emerges from both the top and the bottom of the lower potence area at the screw. One can assign numbers to the major flowers as shown here. Notice that the top vine curls around to terminate at flower 1. The middle vine splits at the letter S, and its upper portion then loops back upwards towards flower number 2, crossing first in front and then behind the vine for flower 1. The image can be schematically drawn as shown here, and as you can see at the base that the vine for flower number 5 is found in the foreground. Okay, here's a second tulip engraving with a different pattern. Now there's only one vine. It grows upward from the base of the plate to the very top. Along the way, as it goes along, there are 4 flowers that are highlighted, including a rather unusual flower at position number 3, just above the fusy arbor. Notice too that the lower potence area now has a different image, a sort of a 2-handled basket. Finally, there's this tulip pattern. Now there are 2 vines that originate from the lower potence, and there are 5 highlight flowers, just as we saw before, and a splitter, as we saw in the first example. But now there's no independent lower vine. So the 3 basic designs are summarized here in a figure from the book. What's interesting, and the reason I bring this out, is that nearly all tulip engraved clocks, and you can examine hundreds of them, nearly all of them will fit into one of these 3 basic designs. And they're also rather chronologic. So while there's overlap, in general, the design 3 on the right is the sign of a later clock. The patterns of engraving can be very useful in helping to date clocks. Here are 2 perfectly beautiful examples of clocks by Joseph Nib.
Het lijkt wel of hij al begonnen is, maar dat kan toch niet?
On the right, on the right is a design 3 engraving, as you can see, now that you know how these work. But on the left, in contrast, is yet another pattern, which I have not shown you yet, which is called a cut stem engraving, because at the bottom of the plate, as you can see, the vines seem to have been cut with a knife or with scissors. Now, cut stem engraving is known to predate all 3 of the standard tulip patterns. And so we can be very confident that the clock on the left was made more than a decade earlier than the one on the right, even though the front of the clocks look rather similar. Engraving is a practical art and technique matters. So here are 2 nib backplates, or portions of them. On top is an engraving for a clock by John Nib, who worked in Oxford without access to high quality engravers. On the bottom is a clock by his brother, Joseph Nib, who worked in London, and the difference in technique is quite obvious. Engraving is also unforgiving. This well-done mid-century work by Andrew Prime is a very dynamic image. I like how the swirling vines at the top are in contrast to the rather static and angular image at the base. If you look at the fusee arbors, you can see that the engraver took care to include the position of the arbors in his engraving because he's decorated them with little flower heads. There's really nothing wrong with this until you compare the birds in the middle. Taking a closer look, it's pretty clear that the bird on the right, his body never really made it fully to the plate. And the hook-shaped structure below the bird has an error in the engraving where the lines cross each other. Unfortunately, with engraving, there is no easy eraser. Here's a flawless engraving for a clock by Henry Jenkins. If you look very carefully, you will see that it is deliberately not perfectly symmetric, especially for the shading. And this is done with the intention of making the image more artistic and more appealing and less machine-like. Finally, before we begin our tour of the 18th century, I want to just take a moment to point out that engraving can also help to validate provenance of clocks and help to uncover details of horologic history. So here are 2 clocks by Joseph Windmills. And if you were to see them separately, you could wonder, well, how can I be sure if these are really both by Windmills? But when you compare the engravings, it's very easy to see that each clock helps to verify its authenticity with respect to the other. So if we look at the backplates of these 2 clocks, and I've erased some of the engraving for the picture, if we look at the backplates, it's easy to see that the similarity of the oval cartouche, these are leaf cartouches, that the similarity of design of the oval cartouche is quite clear. But then when you look at the bottom vines, which I've added here, you can see that they have large swirls that end in a very pronounced bird's head image. And one can become quite confident that this was the work of the same engraver, even though the exact details are not precisely the same, because on the right, there are the little flowers around the arbors for the mainsprings, which is not true on the left, because that's a 3-train clock. If you fill in the lower corner images, the stylistic details, the stylistic similarities remain consistent, even though there are small differences in the details of the image. And then finally, the treatment of the maker's name is also quite similar. So these 2 engravings help to kind of reinforce the veracity that these are both certainly Windmills clocks. What's really more interesting to me, I think, is this pair. Given the complexity of the design that you really now understand, I think we can be all pretty sure that these 2 clocks made by different clockmakers were decorated by the same engraving artist. The fact that they were done by the same engraver means that the 2 clocks co-localize in both space and time. They localize in space because engraving was done near the clockmaker's workshop. You there, apprentice boy, take this plate down to our local engraver and have him decorate it, right? So that was happening for both of these makers. And they co-localize in time because it's really not likely that an artist would create something so similar many years apart. So the study of engraving is really an open field in horology, and it's very likely to uncover all sorts of connections between different clockmakers that we really did not know existed. Well, by the start of the 18th century, tulip patterns would have looked rather old-fashioned. Clients wanted new styles. This backplate has really all the signs of the French Baroque style that we saw at the beginning in Tompien's masterpiece. French Baroque imagery filled drawing books used by students and artists of the period in both England and on the continent. The Baroque images included heroic themes and fantastic creatures. There are vases and floral swags and lions' heads in profile, and leafy borders were all very common visual motifs. Here is a Dan de Lander clock on the left and a Daniel Quare clock on the right. These are both great examples of Baroque engravings. The engravings are visually busy, and I think some would say even cluttered with imagery. There are trumpeting angels and snakes and satyrs and eagles and baskets and vines and trellis work. It's all in there. There's a lot going on. This table clock is by Richard Street, who worked with Tompien. The overall layout here is a bit more harmonious, but it really remains peppered with fantastic images typical of the Baroque period. A more sober example is George Graham's stately clock with pull quarter repeat that's currently at the British Museum. This engraving places much more emphasis on the vines, but it retains Baroque ingredients, including birds, baskets, and garlands. Those with keen eyes may have noticed the small creature in the pendulum regulation area in the upper right, which I've highlighted here with a white circle. And this is a signature image for this particular engraver. Engravers didn't really sign their work with their name, but they often left small visual symbols which can be used to help identify them. Here's a last example of Baroque imagery. This is for a clock by Tompien again. It's the famous Queen Mary Tompien, and it has a much more restrained and quite harmonious pattern. This clock includes a different and very famous signature creature with a long nose that is referred to often as a dolphin. And it identifies the engraver as Bartholomew Lemaire, who is also known as Tompien's Graver 155. And he's considered to be one of the greatest clock engravers of the century. A second major theme of 18th century work is a focus on vines. These three panels show three levels of vine thickness accomplished by different shading techniques. And let's consider examples of each of them in order. Here is a really well-executed, thin vine engraving for a timepiece by Jonathan Lowndes. Notice that all traces of tulips and flowers by this point are long gone. These clocks in this image show intermediate thickness vines. The plate is clearly fully covered, but it doesn't look as cluttered as we saw in the Baroque style. In fact, if with your eye, if you trace the vines and trace the direction of the vines, you will see that in each example, that the plate consists of just one pair of vines symmetrically drawn and growing up from the bottom to the top. Daniel Quare often used thick vine engravers, and this clock is a perfectly representative example of thick vine engraving. The highlight flowers above the cartouche are really commonly seen in this particular style. The pattern is symmetric, but it's quite complex, and it uses vine splitting. As you can see above the cartouche and to either side, the vines split and divide each other. It's actually rather complicated to draw this correctly, but it adds a great deal of depth and interest to the composition. Thick vine engravers often used a large frond cartouche, as seen in these 4 examples. It turns out that the design of the cartouche itself used to frame the maker's name also follows a characteristic change of patterns during the course of the century, but we'll leave a detailed discussion of cartouche designs for some other occasion. Finally, I wanted to show this particular example of thick vine engraving, which is really my favorite. This is a absolutely alive and dynamic format with tremendous complexity to the engraving. There are 4 layers of depth. It's really a superb work that anticipates and looks forward to what would become an appetite for asymmetry of decoration that characterized mid-century English Rococo. And here we have it, right? Here's the clock on the left is by John Ellicott and is on display at the Victoria and Albert in London. And the coffee pot on the right has a very characteristic asymmetric shape to the shield cartouche. Both of these are just delightful examples of English Rococo. Engravers embraced this new desire for asymmetry. This backplate looks rather symmetric at the base, but as you follow along and move your eyes up towards the top, you'll see that it becomes deliberately more complex and deliberately asymmetric as the vines move up towards the top. Charles Burgess's clock also looks basically symmetric at first glance until you kind of outline and follow the individual vines as highlighted here in the different colors. And you realize that this is actually a much more complex composition than first met the eye. This work by Benjamin Saidi is a very effective all-over pattern and really serves to decorate the backplate quite effectively. It actually consists of 6 different vines, no 2 of which are the same, and there's absolutely no symmetry at all to the composition. Well, as the century moved on, the vines did become a little bit more symmetric, but they also became increasingly more abstract in the way in which they were drawn. Here, in this image, they've essentially lost their leaves entirely and have become just loops of abstract curves. This particular engraver drew his vines in a way that, to me, they almost look like ribbons of metal with rivets in them. He frequently included an animal head as his signature icon shown in the blue circle. Here's another example of this man's work for a clock by John Dowson. You might not see the bird at first glance, but he's down there in the bottom. And on close-up, it's pretty hard to miss him once you see him. Here are 2 more examples by well-known makers from the 1760s. And this progression towards ever more abstract curvilinear forms that really move from the organic plant-like vine of the 17th century to a much more abstract design of the 18th century was a continuous progression over the course of time, and leads us to this work by Henry Jenkins, which is a really perfect example, a typical example of backplate engraving from the last quarter of the century. The vines have really now become simply large looping curves, and they provide a sort of framework for the overall design. So that the plate would not appear empty, the intervening space is decorated with small, delicate flowers. The next step in this progression is shown here for a clock by Gray and Vulliamy. We see now that what were once recognizable acanthus vines are now completely abstract curving structures shaped like the letter C. This same style with a strong C shape is seen in this silver caddy. And in addition to the strong C's, the caddy presents the image of a Chinese woman and a pagoda. In fact, a resurgence of interest in China, fueled no doubt by an active economic trade between England and China, characterized English decorative taste after mid-century. Sir William Chambers wrote an influential book called The Design of Chinese Buildings in 1757. And that book resulted in many structures that were built throughout England that imitated Chinese designs, including most famously, the great pagoda at Kew Gardens in London, built in 1762. Exotic images of the Orient, such as those painted by Jean-Baptiste Pillemont, were highly popular throughout England. And by 1770, interior decoration featuring fanciful imagery of the Orient and Chinese Chippendale furniture peaked throughout the country. Well, suddenly, pagodas were everywhere on the backplates of clocks. And they were often drawn in a rather fanciful way with stone walls that have a rather English feel to them. Here's another one. And here's a third. There's quite a few of them. They're easy to find. However, the faraway taste for China as an exotic distant land was not the only exotic focus of England at the time. A second parallel focus was the faraway world of ancient Rome. Robert and James Adams had traveled to Rome and established principles of classical architecture that befitted England's imperial image of itself. And these were recorded in the book shown on the left. Meanwhile, the discovery of the ruins at Pompeii and Herculaneum fueled the English imagination with a romantic sensibility for the distant past. Pierre-Jacques Volaire's paintings of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius became hugely popular all over England. Among the excavations that had been returned to England from Pompeii were urns, and these urns became a focal point of the decorative imagery of Robert Adams, and the urns appear in all sorts of furniture and other artwork of the time. Their popularity was increased through the entrepreneurship of Matthew Boulton and Joshua Wedgwood, who began making replicas of Etruscan urns to sell to an eager buying public. A typical Wedgwood urn is shown in the lower right. I have the sense that Joshua Wedgwood knew a really good business opportunity when he saw one. Well, not surprisingly, images of classical urns with floral festoons promptly fill the backplates, as seen in these two late-century table clocks. Here's another example for clocks by Thomas Hunter and Hollywell and Sons. Now, occasionally, these two twin appetites for distant lands coexist on the same backplate. This is a clock by James Smith that shows a classical Roman column that's flanked by Chinese fences. Here's another one for Smith that features a pagoda in the upper right-hand corner, again with a stone wall, and the pagoda is accompanied by Roman columns in the bottom of the plate. However, by the end of the century, these images had really lost fashion, and engraving sort of devolved into simple border decoration which was nearly always geometric and was rarely floral, as in this example, 4 o'clock by the famous company of Thwaites and Reed. Or the engraver simply placed the maker's name, and only the maker's name, on the backplate, which ironically is exactly how backplate engraving had started 150 years earlier. It's as if we'd come full circle. Clocks had become decidedly more modern, with clean and simple lines on both the front and the back. To the new class of clock owners, decorative hand engraving with flowers and swirls may have seemed rather old-fashioned and rather fussy at the time. But I want to emphasize that the decline in engraving was not because of any lack of talent. Just look at this, it's quite amazing. On the left is the Tompion clock that we saw at the start of this presentation, made in 1705 to 1707. Nearly 100 years later, on the right, in 1798, Gravel and Tolkien produced a clock deliberately designed to reflect Tompion's work. And so if you turn them around, how were the engravings done? Well, I think it's fair to say that the engraving on the right by Gravel and Tolkien is every bit the equal of that which was done a century earlier. But this right-hand image, this more recent work, as expert as it is, was really no longer of the times. Times had changed. A new century of modernism was about to begin. It was time to let go of the music of George Frederick Handel. After all, Beethoven had arrived.
Okay, so